He had minutes left, and he spent them on a stranger. His chest could not fill with air without lifting his own body weight against 2 iron nails. Something in the next 60 seconds would decide where he spent forever. Above his head, a Roman soldier had nailed a strip of wood with words no one asked him to write. 3 crosses stood against a white afternoon sky outside the western wall of Jerusalem, and only one of the men on them was innocent. The hill was called Golgotha, the place of the skull. By the 9th hour, the crowd below had thinned to soldiers, a handful of mourners, and the merely curious, the kind of people who stay for an execution the way others stay for weather, watching the sky rather than each other. He would not live to see evening. No one on that hill knew his name. No one would ask for it again. The wind carried the smell of the city behind them. Wood smoke, animal pens, the last preparations for a festival that would begin at sundown, whether or not 3 men finished dying before it did. This is his story. What little of it we have, and what he did with the last of it. No one recorded his name. The Gospels call him nothing but a criminal, one of 2, hung on either side of a rabbi from Nazareth, who Rome had decided was dangerous enough to kill in public, on a hill, visible from the main road into the city, where every pilgrim entering Jerusalem for Passover would be forced to see him. This was never accidental. Golgotha sat just outside the city walls, along a well-traveled route, chosen specifically because Rome wanted its executions witnessed, not hidden. That was the entire purpose of crucifixion. It was never only a punishment for the man on the cross, it was a message, written in a human body, addressed to everyone who might consider defying the empire that had governed Judea for nearly a century by then. The Greek word used to describe him is lestis, not a pickpocket, not a petty thief, the kind who might be flogged in the marketplace and released by nightfall. The word means something closer to bandit, insurgent, a man who took by force what Rome had already taken from his people first. It is the very same word used for Barabbas, the prisoner the crowd chose to release, instead of Jesus, only hours earlier that same morning. It is the same word the first-century Jewish historian Josephus later used to describe the armed resistance fighters who would rise against Rome in the Great Revolt of 66, decades after this particular afternoon, but grown from the very same soil of grievance, the same decades of occupation, the same slow erosion of patience. Judea in the spring of the crucifixion was not a peaceful province, whatever image later centuries have painted of quiet hillsides and gentle shepherds. It was an occupied territory, governed by a Roman prefect, who answered to Rome and to almost no one else. Pontius Pilate had held that post for several years by this point, and Roman records outside Scripture, including the writings of the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, describe him as a governor known for cruelty, inflexibility, and a willingness to use violence to keep the peace. Taxation under Roman rule fell heavily on ordinary families, extracted through a system of local tax collectors who answered to Rome and often extracted more than was owed, leaving many households with barely enough grain stored to survive the winter months. Men who resisted that occupation, through robbery, through revolt, through whatever means remained available to the powerless, were crucified along Judea's roads by the dozens, sometimes by the hundreds in a single year, as a public warning that never seemed to work for very long. The historian Josephus records mass crucifixions carried out by Roman commanders in the decades surrounding this event, entire hillsides lined with crosses after failed uprisings, a punishment so common in that century that it had become part of the landscape itself. The mechanics of crucifixion itself were designed with a specific cruelty in mind: maximum visibility, maximum duration, minimum mercy. Condemned men typically carried the crossbeam, not the full cross, which remained fixed at the execution site. through the streets to the place of execution, a public procession meant to humiliate as much as to transport. Death could take anywhere from several hours to several days, depending on the physical condition of the condemned man and whether any intervention hastened it. Soldiers assigned to crucifixion duty in Jerusalem during festival weeks, when Rome kept extra troops garrisoned specifically to manage the swollen population of pilgrims, would have carried out this exact procedure with the routine efficiency of men who had done it many times before and expected to do it many times again. He had likely lived that life, whatever exact shape it took. Hungry seasons, a family, or the fading memory of one, a cause that felt righteous in the dark and looked like a crime the moment daylight and Roman law reached it. Sign 1. His hands, when they nailed him to the wood, did not shake. Soldiers who performed this task daily, and in Jerusalem during the festival season, they performed it often, noted that most condemned men fought the nails with everything still left in their bodies, some screaming, some praying, some simply thrashing against an instinct no mind can override. He did none of this. He had expected this ending for years, and something in his stillness carried the particular calm of a man who has finally run out of surprise. Sign 2. He did not look at the crowd gathered at the base of the hill. Men who die performing courage look at the crowd, searching it for someone who might carry away a story worth remembering them by. He looked instead at the man crucified beside him, the one who, unlike him, had done nothing at all to earn this hill. Sign 3. The placard above that man's head read, according to John's Gospel, in 3 languages at once: Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, written in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, so that no traveler passing along the road to Golgotha, whatever language he read, could misunderstand the warning Rome intended by it. This is what happens to men who claim what belongs to Caesar alone. He could read at least one of those 3 languages, likely the Aramaic-inflected Hebrew of the marketplace, rather than the Latin of Roman administration, and something about the words above that innocent man's head did not match what he had watched with his own swollen, half-shut eye for the last several hours. A man who had remained almost entirely silent through mockery that would have broken most hardened rebels into cursing everyone within earshot of the hill. Geography mattered here in ways easy to miss at a distance of 2,000 years. Golgotha sat just outside the city's western gate, close enough that anyone standing on the higher rooftops inside Jerusalem's walls could likely make out the shapes of the 3 crosses against the sky. Roman practice generally placed executions along well-traveled roads outside a city's boundaries, both for reasons of ritual cleanliness under Jewish custom and for the simple, practical purpose of maximizing how many travelers would pass close enough to see. The road from the coast, the road pilgrims walked in from Galilee, the road merchants used to bring goods into the Passover markets, all of them converged near this single hill. There was no version of that week where a man could enter Jerusalem for the festival without walking past what Rome had built there as a warning. The social hierarchy of the moment mattered too. Roman citizens, whatever their crime, were rarely crucified at all. It was considered too degrading a death for someone holding citizenship, reserved instead mostly for slaves, foreigners, and provincials convicted of serious offenses against the state. This alone tells us something about the 2 men hanging beside Jesus that day. Whatever they had done, Rome had already decided, simply by choosing this method of execution, that they belonged to a category of person whose death was meant to be watched rather than mourned. The political arrangement governing Judea at this point in history was itself a layered and uneasy one. Herod the Great had ruled as a client king under Rome's authority a generation earlier, and after his death, the region had been divided among his sons, with Judea eventually placed under direct Roman administration through prefects like Pilate, rather than left to a local dynasty at all. This meant that real power over matters of life and death, including the authority to approve or deny a crucifixion, rested with a Roman official who had no particular loyalty to the people he governed, and considerable pressure from Rome itself to keep the province quiet, productive, and free of the kind of unrest that might draw unwanted attention from the emperor. The high priesthood, meanwhile, operated under a similar arrangement, appointed and removed at the prefect's discretion, which left even Judea's religious leadership walking a careful line between serving their own people and avoiding any appearance of disloyalty to Rome. Every person present at that crucifixion, from the soldiers to the priests to the two men dying beside Jesus, existed somewhere inside this same tangle of occupation, compromise, and survival. Every criminal carries a memory of who he was before the first crime. Somewhere in his life there had been a table with food on it, shared with people who trusted him enough to sit close. There had been a version of him who kept his word, who could be sent to market with a coin and trusted to return with the change counted correctly. Perhaps he remembered the noise of Jerusalem before Passover, the smell of roasting lamb drifting from 100 courtyards at once, the sound of pilgrims singing the Psalms of Ascent as they climbed the winding road toward the temple gates, hundreds of voices rising together, the way water rises before it finally overflows its banks. He would have known that sound once, before it became something he only watched from the shadow of a doorway, no longer welcome at the table it rose from, no longer part of the procession he used to walk inside of rather than beside. Perhaps he remembered a moment of genuine belief, a wandering teacher who had once passed through his village on the way to somewhere else, a story about a coming kingdom that would finally set right what Rome had bent crooked, a hope that Judea would not always live under a foreign governor's hand, the way his father's small plot of land had lived under a foreign tax collector's ledger, assessed and reassessed until there was nothing left worth planting the following spring. Faith and violence lived closer together in that century than most modern viewers expect. Many who eventually took up the sword did so because they believed, with everything left in them, that God's ancient promises about a coming king were finally close enough to reach out and touch. Judas the Galilean had led one such uprising against a Roman census only a generation before this hill, and the memory of it, along with its brutal suppression, would still have been alive in the stories older men told younger ones. Perhaps there had been a wife who used to wait at the village well past sundown, watching the road for a shape that matched his walk. Perhaps there had been children who learned early not to ask where their father went at night, the way children in occupied places often learn to stop asking questions before anyone explains why. The Gospels are entirely silent on these details, and sacred chronicles will not invent what Scripture does not say, but the surrounding history of the period tells us plainly enough what kind of life tended to produce men who ended their days labeled lestes on a Roman cross. It was rarely a life that began in violence. It was a life that arrived there gradually, one narrowing choice at a time, the way a road narrows into a single footpath long before a man notices he has left the wider way behind. Perhaps, too, there had been a season of genuine hope, a harvest that came in well, a year when the tribute did not swallow everything, a brief stretch when believing in a better future did not yet feel foolish. Every man who eventually chooses the sword can usually point back to an earlier version of himself who still believed in the plow. Perhaps he remembered the specific weight of a debt he could never fully climb out from under. The way tenant farmers across Galilee and Judea in this period often owed a portion of every harvest to a landowner, another portion to the temple, and a final portion to Rome itself through its client system of tax collection. A single bad season, a single failed crop, could push a family from struggling to landless within a year. Historians of the period describe exactly this pattern behind much of the social unrest of the first century. Not abstract, political grievance, but the very concrete experience of watching land pass out of a family's hands into a wealthier neighbor's, one bad harvest at a time. Perhaps he remembered, too, the moment the math simply stopped working, the day he understood that no amount of honest labor was going to close the gap between what his family owed and what his family had. Every historical account of banditry in this period describes men who began as farmers, or fishermen, or laborers, and only became lesties after the ordinary paths had closed in front of them one by one. It rarely began with a taste for violence. It began with arithmetic that could not be solved any other way. Perhaps he remembered the specific faces of the men who had joined him along the way, not villains in the way later storytellers might imagine them, but men in circumstances close to his own, each carrying a version of the same grievance, the same narrowed horizon, the same slow slide from farmer or fisherman into something the authorities had a single word for. There is a kind of brotherhood that grows in desperation, the way it rarely grows in comfort. And whatever else these bands of men were, they were often bound to each other by something closer to loyalty than to greed. Some of them would have died on hills exactly like this one before him. Some of them would die on hills exactly like this one after him. He was neither the first nor the last, only the one whose final hour Scripture happened to record. Perhaps he remembered a particular night when the choice to cross fully into that life had not felt like a single decisive moment at all, but simply the next logical step after a string of smaller ones. A debt not repaid, a threat not withdrawn, a door that had been slowly closing for years, finally shutting all the way. Most falls, examined closely, look less like a cliff and more like a slope, so gradual that the person walking down it does not notice the grade has changed until they are already at the bottom. Archaeological work in the region around Jerusalem has confirmed much of the physical world these two condemned men would have known. Excavations of first-century roads, agricultural terraces, and village foundations across Judea and Galilee show a countryside dense with small farming communities, most operating on thin margins even in good years, connected by roads Rome itself had built and maintained largely for the movement of troops and tax revenue, rather than for the convenience of the people living beside them. It was a landscape built, quite literally, around the needs of an occupying power, with ordinary life arranged in whatever space remained around it. He was not born wanting to die on a Roman execution hill outside his own capital city. Almost no one is born wanting that. But history had narrowed his choices year by year. Occupation, debt, hunger, the slow erosion of a man's options, until violence stops looking like a decision at all and starts looking like the only door history has left unlocked for him. Perhaps in an earlier season of his life, he had even stood near enough to hear one of Jesus' own sermons without knowing whose voice he was listening to. Galilee was not a large region, and a wandering teacher who drew crowds in the thousands would have been difficult to entirely avoid for anyone moving through the same hill country. If he had heard him then, he would have heard a message strange to a man who had built his life on the logic of force, that the kingdom of God belonged not to the strong who seized it, but to the poor in spirit, the meek, those who mourned. It would have meant little to him at the time. It would mean everything to him now. There is meaning worth pausing on in names themselves. The very word Golgotha, Aramaic for place of the skull, likely referred to the shape of the outcropping itself, a rounded hill that from certain angles resembled a human skull, though later tradition also connected it to a belief that it marked the burial place of Adam. Even the ground beneath the two condemned men that day carried inherited meaning, a location already layered with stories about human mortality long before that particular Friday arrived. And now here he was, nailed to a beam of rough wood, beside a man whose only recorded crime, according to the very sign hammered above his own head, was claiming to be a king. A rebel's death handed out for the crime of a king's claim. The two things were not nearly as different to Rome as they were to God, and both men on either side of Jesus had learned that distinction the hard way in the very same afternoon, on the very same hill, under the very same merciless sun. The first moment of pressure came from the crowd gathered below the hill. Soldiers gambled for the seamless robe of the man in the center. John's Gospel notes this detail with a precision no invented story would bother including, a small, almost bureaucratic fact that only an eyewitness standing close enough to see the dice would think worth recording. 4 soldiers, one garment too finely woven to tear evenly, so they cast lots for it instead. A detail so mundane, it reads more like a duty log than a sacred text, which is exactly why historians take it seriously. Religious leaders stood near the base of the hill and mocked the man in the center. He saved others. Let him save himself, using the very fact of his suffering as evidence against him. Their logic simple and entirely merciless in its internal consistency. A real king, in their understanding, would not be dying like a common criminal on public display. The second moment of pressure came from the man crucified on the other side of Jesus. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." The words were not theology, whatever they may have sounded like to bystanders. They were the last transaction of a man who had spent his entire life negotiating for one more hour, one more chance, one more way out of whatever trouble he had wandered into, and who now, with nothing left in his hands to bargain with, was trying it one final time against impossible odds. The third moment of pressure came from inside his own body, the particular temptation every crucified man faced somewhere in his final hour: to spend his last remaining breath on anger. To die shouting at the God who had allowed this. To die exactly the way the other criminal was dying, cursing at the one man on that hill who could have rightfully called the whole arrangement unjust and been entirely correct to say so. He felt that temptation clearly. The Gospel account does not pretend otherwise. Luke records that both criminals initially joined in the general mockery of Jesus. Matthew's Gospel confirms the same detail independently, noting that the robbers who were crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Mark records it as well, 3 separate accounts agreeing on a detail that reflects poorly on both criminals, which is itself a small argument for its truthfulness. Invented legends rarely include unflattering details about their own supporting characters. Something changed in only one of these 2 men, and it changed inside the span of a few final, ragged breaths, in front of no crowd that could ever explain afterward exactly why. "Don't you fear God?" he said to the man beside him, his own voice breaking against lungs that could no longer draw a full breath. "We're punished justly. We're getting exactly what we deserve for our crimes. But this man has done nothing wrong." No one had defended Jesus like that all day, not a single disciple. Most had scattered hours earlier in the garden, the moment the arresting soldiers arrived with torches and swords. Not one voice from the religious crowd gathered below, men who had spent years studying the very scriptures this moment would fulfill. The defense came instead from the one person on that entire hill with absolutely nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to protect, by staying quiet and letting the mockery continue unchallenged. Identification scene 1. A soldier standing nearby, bored with an execution detail he had performed a dozen times before that spring, leaned on his spear and muttered something to a colleague about the heat of the afternoon. The mundane detail of a job that simply does not stop being a job, even while 3 men are dying in front of the person performing it. Identification scene 2. Somewhere in the thin crowd, a mother pulled her young child's face away from the sight and toward her own shoulder instead, the private instinct to shield the innocent from horror persisting even in the middle of a public spectacle designed to be watched by everyone. Identification scene 3. The other criminal fell briefly silent after being rebuked by the man beside him. Not repentant himself, not yet. Only startled the way a person goes quiet when someone unexpectedly speaks an uncomfortable truth about him out loud, in front of witnesses, with no warning given beforehand. Identification Scene 4. A group of women who had followed Jesus from Galilee stood at a distance, close enough to see but too far to be heard. The particular helplessness of loving someone you cannot reach in their final hour, watching from exactly the range grief usually allows. There was a fourth moment of pressure as well, quieter than the others, but no less real. The simple, physical exhaustion of continuing to disagree with everyone around him. It is easier, in almost every circumstance, to go along with the room. The room that afternoon had already reached its verdict on the man in the center, and reaching a different conclusion meant standing entirely alone in it, with no one left to nod along, no crowd of agreement to borrow courage from. He had spent his whole life as part of one crowd or another, a resistance movement, a band of men who moved together, a cause that promised solidarity even when it delivered little else. In his final hour, for the first time perhaps in years, his conclusion belonged to no one but himself. The religious leaders below continued their taunting even as the sky began to change color overhead, the light growing strange and heavy in a way witnesses would later struggle to describe precisely. Their argument had a certain internal logic that made it difficult to refute from where they stood. If this man were truly the promised king, surely God would not allow him to die exactly like every failed rebel before him, nailed to Roman wood outside the city walls. It was not an unreasonable position, given everything they had been taught to expect a king to look like. It was simply, as it turned out, wrong. A Roman centurion stood near enough to hear everything, the mockery, the rebuke, the growing unease in his own chest, that this execution was somehow different from the routine ones he had overseen before. Later tradition would remember him as the soldier who, watching the manner of this particular death, concluded aloud that the man really had been innocent, perhaps even something more. His presence at the foot of the cross is a detail worth sitting with. Even among the men whose job it was to carry out Rome's executions without question, something about this one afternoon refused to sit quietly within the routine. The temptation towards silence deserves its own weight here too. Speaking cost him more than it would cost a healthy man arguing across a table. Every word required him to fight his own collapsing diaphragm for the air to shape it. Silence was not cowardice in that condition. It was the physically rational choice. Choosing to speak anyway, twice in defense of someone else, and then in request for himself, meant choosing pain on top of pain, for a cause with no earthly payoff whatsoever. There was no one left to impress. There was no reputation left to protect or improve. Whatever moved him to speak came from somewhere other than self-interest, because self-interest, by every rational measure available to him in that hour, argued for silence. There is also the matter of what he risked socially by speaking, small as that risk may sound beside the larger fact of his approaching death. The other criminal beside him had been, until that moment, the closest thing to an ally he had left in the world, a fellow condemned man, sharing the same fate, the same hill, the same final hours. Rebuking him publicly meant severing that last small thread of solidarity, choosing truth over the comfort of shared bitterness. Even at the very end of a life, the instinct to stay aligned with the person nearest to you is a strong one. He broke it anyway, for the sake of a stranger who could offer him nothing in return except, as it turned out, everything. He said nothing for a long moment after that, his eyes fixed on the wood above the innocent man's head. King of the Jews. His hands could not move at all anymore. His lungs burned with every shallow breath he managed to pull in. If it's true, if any of it is true, He was not thinking of doctrine in that moment. He was thinking only of the last time he had believed anything at all, about anyone. A childhood prayer, half forgotten, a festival long ago, before the debts began. A father's voice reciting the Shema before sunrise, steady in a way nothing in his own life had been steady since. He thought of none of the things a dying man is supposed to think of in his final hour. He thought only of the man beside him, still breathing, still nearly silent, still somehow carrying an unbearable stillness in a place built entirely for despair. That was the moment something inside him that had always doubted finally stopped doubting. The doubt did not leave gently. It simply had nowhere left standing room to occupy. For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind moving low across the hill and the distant, disinterested murmur of soldiers who had already stopped watching the men they were guarding. Time behaves strangely in a body that knows it is ending. Minutes stretch. A single breath can hold an entire unspoken decision inside it. He was not the kind of man who had spent his life examining himself closely. Reflection was a luxury of people with time to spare, and time had never been something his life afforded in any generous measure. But here, nailed in place with nowhere left to go and nothing left to do but wait, examination arrived whether he invited it or not. Every choice that had led him to this hill lined up behind his closed eyes in a way that felt less like memory and more like evidence, presented plainly, without a lawyer on either side to argue it differently. And still, none of it condemned him as completely as he expected it to. Something in the man beside him, his silence, his refusal to answer cruelty with cruelty, the strange dignity he carried even while his own body failed exactly as everyone else's was failing, suggested a different kind of verdict was somehow still possible. Not earned, not yet understood, only, for the first time in longer than he could remember, possible. He could not lift his own chest anymore without agony tearing through what remained of his strength. Each word now cost him whole minutes of his remaining life, and he had already spent several of those minutes defending a stranger instead of pleading for himself. Physical weakness. His vision narrowed hard at the edges, the world shrinking to a tunnel of white light. The early afternoon sun overhead had turned merciless, and he could no longer feel his own hands at all. Only the constant pull of his own body weight against the nails, a pain that had moved past the point where pain still has language, the body simply enduring what the mind could no longer name or describe to itself. Public exposure. The same crowd that had jeered at the man in the center now glanced upward at him too, visibly confused by a criminal defending the very man they had come specifically to watch die. A few of them laughed, low and uneasy, unsure what to make of it. It changed nothing in him. He had already lost every reputation worth losing hours before this hill, in courtrooms and back-alley dealings that no longer mattered to him in the slightest. Self-doubt. He had, until that very hour, believed his entire life added up to nothing worth remembering. A soldier for a cause that had failed completely. A man who had taken by force what he could never have earned honestly. A name that would not survive even the coming week in anyone's memory. Now, in the last minutes available to him on earth, he wondered whether this, one true sentence, spoken in defense of a dying stranger who owed him nothing, might be the single thing he had ever done in his life that actually mattered. An old, easier comfort still waited for him in that hour, close enough to reach for. He could simply stop talking. He could close his eyes and let the remaining time pass in silence, the way most condemned men on Roman crosses did, saving what little strength remained purely for the act of breathing. Silence would have cost him nothing more than what was already being taken from him regardless. He did not take it. No one beside him offered any comfort at all. The other criminal was still cursing under his breath, working through his own private, furious negotiation with a God he did not yet believe would ever answer him. Even in his final hour, surrounded on every side by people, soldiers, mourners, the merely curious who had wandered up from the road, he was entirely alone in what he was beginning to understand about himself and about the man beside him. The loneliness was real even 3 feet from another dying human being. Almost surrender. For one full breath, he seriously considered joining the mockery instead of resisting it. It would have been easier, and it would have matched precisely what everyone standing below already expected from a man exactly like him. The crowd wanted a criminal to die like a criminal, consistent to the very end. Meeting that low expectation would have cost him nothing at all, and would have required no courage he did not already possess in abundance. He hesitated there, on the edge of that easier road. The weight of that particular hesitation is not recorded anywhere in Scripture, but every crucified man before him and after him faced the same fork in the same final hour, and most, by every historical account we have, chose the easier path down it. Imperfect support figure, the man on his other side offered him no comfort whatsoever, only continued mockery, continued bitterness, a fellow sufferer who could not offer any real solidarity because he had none left inside himself to give. Sometimes the person suffering right beside us in our worst hour cannot help us, not because they do not care, but because they are drowning in the very same water we are, with no strength left over to reach across it. The sky, several accounts note, had darkened unusually for that hour of the afternoon. Luke describes darkness falling over the whole land from roughly the 6th hour to the 9th, a detail some historians have connected to the kind of regional dust storm or unusual atmospheric event that ancient writers occasionally recorded around significant deaths, though the gospel writers themselves offer it without natural explanation, simply as a fact of that particular afternoon. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that belongs only to dying slowly in public. It is not the exhaustion of labor, which at least ends with rest. It is the exhaustion of a body fighting, minute after minute, simply to keep drawing breath, while an audience watches to see how long the fighting will last. Crucifixion killed primarily through asphyxiation. The position of the body made it necessary to push upward against the nail through the feet in order to expand the chest enough to breathe, an act that grew more agonizing and less possible as the hours wore on and the muscles of the legs failed. Physicians who have studied the physiology of the practice describe a slow, escalating suffocation, punctuated by brief moments of relief, bought at an increasingly unbearable price. This was the specific mechanism working against him in his final hour, hollowing out whatever strength remained for anything beyond the next single breath. And still, somewhere inside that mechanism of slow suffocation, he found enough air for one sentence in defense of a stranger, and then, later, enough air for one more request on his own behalf. Both sentences cost him minutes he did not have to spare. He spent them anyway. There is a particular kind of collapse that has nothing to do with weakness of character, the collapse of a body that has simply run out of resources to keep arguing with gravity. By this point in the afternoon, hours into the execution, his muscles would have begun to fail in a specific, documented pattern. The legs first, unable to keep pushing upward to relieve the pressure on the chest, then the arms, unable to bear the redistributed weight, then finally the diaphragm itself, no longer able to expand fully no matter how much, will remain behind it. Medical historians who have studied crucifixion describe this progression as remarkably consistent across accounts from the period, a slow handover of the body's systems, one by one, to exhaustion. Thirst would have been unbearable by this hour as well, following hours already spent without water under direct sun, the mouth and throat dried past the point of easy speech, which makes every sentence he still managed to produce even more costly than it first appears. John's Gospel records that Jesus himself, at some point in these final hours, said simply, "I am thirsty," a detail confirming what physiology alone would already suggest about the condition of every man on that hill by mid-afternoon. And beneath all of it, the ordinary business of the day continued around them with an indifference that must have been its own particular cruelty. Merchants still sold bread near the city gate. Soldiers still changed shifts according to schedule. Somewhere inside Jerusalem's walls, preparations for the Sabbath meal continued in kitchens that had no reason yet to know how significant this particular execution would become. Death, even a death like this one, rarely stops the world around it from turning at its usual pace. The turning point was not a glorious moment. It was an ordinary act, performed in extraordinary and unbearable pain. He did not deliver a sermon in that moment, nor did he have the breath left for one. He did not ask for forgiveness the way religious men had trained others to ask for it over the years. Not through a ritual, not through the temple and its sacrifices, not through a priest standing somewhere between himself and God, with the proper words prepared in advance for exactly this occasion. He simply turned his head, with whatever strength remained in his neck after hours on the cross, toward the man hanging in the center. "Jesus," he said, "remember me when you come into your kingdom." That was the entire request, start to finish. No confession of every crime he had ever committed. No promise to live differently going forward. He would not live at all past this same afternoon, and both men understood that plainly, without either needing to say it aloud. Just a name, spoken directly, and a memory, asked for by a man who had absolutely nothing left to offer in exchange for it. No coin, no sacrifice, no years of future service still owed to anyone. It was the smallest act available to a dying man in his condition, and it turned out to be entirely enough. Seconds later, everything he had ever believed about earning his way toward God fell away from him completely. The years of trying, of taking by force, of proving himself through the only currency the world had left available to him: force and fear and the threat of violence. A moment after that, an answer arrived that no religious leader in Jerusalem had ever offered anyone so plainly, so immediately, without a single condition attached to it beforehand. Weeks would not pass for him the way they typically do in most stories of turning points. There would be no slow return to health for this man, no gradual rebuilding of a broken life over months or years. His entire transformation, beginning to end, would take place within the space of one single afternoon, which makes what happened next even harder to explain away as coincidence or wishful thinking, or a story added later to comfort other criminals facing the same hill. In the years that followed, early Christian writers would return again and again to this exact exchange, finding in it something they could offer to people who believed their own lives had gone too far past the point of rescue. A man who had spent his entire life taking became, in his final minutes, a man remembered for one thing only: asking. Augustine, writing centuries later, would point to this same man as proof that no one should presume on God's mercy, since only one thief was saved, and no one should despair of it either, since one thief was. The line has survived because it captures something true about the strange narrowness and the strange generosity of that single afternoon. One door, open exactly wide enough for exactly one man to walk through it in time, and he did. Consider, too, what he did not have available to him that religious tradition had always insisted mattered. He could not be baptized. There was no water on that hill, and no time remaining even if there had been. He could not make a sacrifice at the temple, could not offer the correct offering through the correct priest on the correct day. He could not spend years demonstrating a changed life through changed behavior because he did not have years, or even another full day. every external marker that his own religious culture had used for generations to signal that a person belonged to God was unavailable to him in that hour. He had only his voice and the little air still moving through his ruined lungs, and he used both for the one sentence that mattered. "Truly I tell you," Jesus answered, "today you will be with me in paradise. Not someday. Not if you prove yourself worthy first. Today." The word landed on a dying man who had done absolutely nothing to earn it, spoken by another dying man who had every right in that moment to promise nothing at all, and who chose instead, freely, to promise everything within his power to give. He did not need to be believed by the crowd gathered below him. He did not need vindication, or a monument, or his own name remembered by history. And history, as it happened, would not remember it at all. He needed exactly one thing in his final hour on earth, and he received it in full, without delay, without condition. Later that same day, soldiers would break the legs of the criminal still living, a Roman practice called Crucifixion, used to hasten death before the Jewish Sabbath began at sundown, as John's Gospel explains in careful detail, since Jewish law required that bodies be removed from crosses before the arrival of the holy day. Jesus, already dead by that point, was spared this additional violence, his side pierced instead with a soldier's spear, simply to confirm that death had already occurred. The other two men were not spared. Their final minutes came with additional suffering layered onto what their bodies had already endured for hours under the open sky. His own body would be taken down, like any other executed criminals, likely carried to an unmarked grave somewhere outside the city walls, the way archaeologists have in fact found other crucified remains from that exact century. A single heel bone, pierced clean through by an iron nail still lodged inside it, discovered north of Jerusalem in 1968 at a site called Givat HaMivtar, the only forensic proof of Roman crucifixion ever directly recovered from that era, and a quiet, physical confirmation that men exactly like him were entirely real, and suffered in exactly this manner, in exactly this century, on exactly this kind of rough Roman wood. No shrine remembers where he was ultimately buried. No gospel ever gives him a name of his own. Later, Christian tradition would eventually assign him one, calling him Dismas in texts written generations afterward, though Scripture itself leaves him nameless throughout, which may be its own quiet kind of mercy, a man remembered in the end, only for what he said in his final minutes, rather than for anything at all he had done in the years leading up to them. But somewhere beyond the reach of Rome's road signs and Jerusalem's restless crowds, beyond the mockery and the soldiers' spears and the breaking of bones that would come after sundown that same evening, a promise had already been kept in full, spoken quietly between two dying men who had nothing left in the entire world but each other, and the truth passing between them. Consider what that promise actually required of the man who received it. Not years of proven character, not a record of good deeds to offset a record of crimes, not even the strength to finish a full sentence without his voice breaking under the weight of his own collapsing lungs. It required only a turn of the head and an honest request made to the one person on that hill who had both the right and the power to grant it. Every religious system he had grown up inside had taught him, in one form or another, that access to God had to be earned through years of law-keeping, sacrifice, and ritual observance carried out correctly. In the space of a single afternoon, all of that was set aside for a man who had run out of afternoons to offer. It is worth sitting for a moment with how strange this would have sounded to anyone standing at the base of that hill who overheard it. A criminal, condemned under Roman law for offenses serious enough to warrant crucifixion, receiving from a dying rabbi a promise no synagogue elder, no temple priest, No religious authority in Jerusalem had ever offered so plainly or so immediately. If the story is true, and 3 independent gospel accounts converge on the surrounding events, even where their details of this exact exchange differ slightly, then it says something almost unbearably direct about the nature of the God being described. That the door, in the end, was never as far away as a lifetime of failure had made it feel. The word paradise itself carries its own history worth noting. It derives from an old Persian word for a walled garden or royal park, absorbed into Greek and eventually into the vocabulary of Jewish and Christian writers as shorthand for the restored presence of God, the garden regained, after everything that had gone wrong since the garden lost. That Jesus reached for this particular word, in this particular moment, addressed to this particular man, suggests something worth lingering on. Not merely survival after death, not merely an ending to suffering, but a return to a place of belonging that the man beside him had perhaps never known he was still permitted to enter. 2 men died that afternoon within feet of each other, both criminals under Roman law, both suffering the same physical death by the same method over the same number of hours. Only one of them is remembered for anything other than his crime. The difference between them was not the length of a life well lived, nor the weight of good deeds carefully accumulated. The difference was a single sentence, spoken honestly, to the only person on that hill who had the standing to answer it. Somewhere outside the city, as the light shifted back toward its ordinary color, and the crowd finally began to disperse for the evening, 3 bodies remained on 3 crosses a while longer, indistinguishable to any passing stranger who had not heard what one of them had said only a short while before. Rome kept extra cohorts stationed in Jerusalem specifically during Passover, aware that a festival commemorating liberation from a foreign empire tended to stir dangerous ideas in a population currently living under a different foreign empire. Pilate himself, according to some historical accounts, would relocate temporarily from his usual residence in Caesarea to Jerusalem during the festival precisely to oversee security in person. This was not an ordinary Friday in an ordinary week. It was the single most tense and heavily guarded stretch of the entire Roman calendar in Judea, and 3 crosses on a hill outside the city walls were, from the empire's point of view, simply routine maintenance of public order during a dangerous season, a small, forgettable footnote in a governor's report, if it merited a mention at all. And yet this one afternoon, among all the others Rome oversaw that century, is the one still remembered 2,000 years later, not primarily for the 2 men whose crimes justified their sentence under Roman law, but for the 7 words one of them found the breath to speak, and the one sentence spoken back to him in return. 2,000 years later, his words are still the ones quoted at hospital bedsides, in prison chapels, in the final hours of people who believe, as he once believed, that they have gone too far to be received by anything good. 4 words, spoken through a collapsing chest, on a hill that has long since changed shape and been built over by a city that expanded far beyond its old walls. The hill itself is mostly gone, or at least no longer certainly identifiable. The sentence outlasted it. If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments. I read every one.